and welcome to or welcome back to the channel. This is Dead to Me True Crime, and this is part 24 of our series on Laci Peterson. You are absolutely in the right place. Thank you so much for joining me. There are a few things I want to mention before we dive in. First and foremost, I'd like to properly thank all of you for being here and for supporting the channel. You guys are awesome. I'm glad to finally tell you all how amazing you really are. If you're new here, again, welcome. This is part 24 of the series, so if you haven't checked out the previous episodes, I've linked the playlist in the description below this video so you can get caught up. That might be necessary for what we're getting into today. Can't touch on everything we've talked about previously, so that might be a good idea. If you've been here before, welcome back. I know it's been a little while, but I've been working on some changes. I hope you guys love the new studio as much as I do. I kind of felt forced to adapt here, and there may be more changes to come, but we can talk about that stuff another time. If enough of y'all are interested in what's going on behind the scenes, let me know in the comments and we can schedule a live with a chat and we can go into all that stuff. I can answer questions. Y'all can give your opinion on the new format and you can make suggestions on other things, and that would be awesome. But I don't want to eat up too much of our time going into that kind of thing today. Today, we're going back to the spring of 2003 and the evidence seized from Scott Peterson's vehicle on the morning he was finally arrested. Really quickly, want to remind you guys to please keep liking, sharing, and subscribing. Become a Dead to Me member if you can. I've created a custom set of clue emojis and badges exclusively for members to use in the comments. I appreciate every bit of encouragement and love you guys send my way, and it goes a long way. This channel would not be here without y'all, so let's get into what we're here for. We have quite a bit of information to get through in this episode, and so without further ado, this is Dead to Me True Crime. At the end of our last episode, Scott Peterson was arrested and transported along with his vehicle to the Department of Justice field office in downtown San Diego. On the 18th of April 2003, DOJ supervising agent Ernie Lyman detained Scott in front of the Torrey Pines golf course. Lyman initiated a felony traffic stop and Scott was handcuffed at 11:10 that morning. Modesto detectives Craig Grogan, John Bueller, and Al Brocchini arrived on the scene minutes later. Lead Detective Grogan informed Scott that he was being taken into custody, charged with 2 counts of felony murder, and presented the warrant issued out of Stanislaus County. Detective John Bueller conducted a preliminary search of Scott's 1984 Mercedes while it was still parked in front of the golf course. As Bueller approached the car, Scott made him aware of an envelope containing $10,000 in the compartment of the driver's side door. You'll recall from our previous episode that Scott purchased the vehicle from Michael Griffin on the 12th of April, and he put the car in his mother, Jacqueline Peterson's name. Just to brush up briefly on the timeline, a major storm hit the San Francisco Bay the same day Scott bought the car. That was the 12th, which was a Saturday. Connor's remains were found Sunday, and Laci was recovered Monday, which was the 14th. Scott's warrant was signed on the 17th, and he was arrested the following day. Top level, that's where we're at, and the $10,000 tucked in the driver's side door brings us to Scott's mother and her complex explanation for why she not only gave him the money, but went out of her way to get him cash. For the sake of time, I can't dig too far into Jackie's testimony here, but it's interesting to say the least. I did want to mention that Jackie said it'd been her idea. It was her idea for Scott to put the Mercedes in her name. As for the $10,000, we'll shorten Jackie's story to simply say that the cash was a loan, not for Scott, but for her other son, John. John wanted to buy Scott's truck, but he was broke. So she loaned John the money and paid Scott directly for the equity in the truck. And it helped Scott too because she said Scott was also broke and couldn't afford the payments. So Jackie said she gave Scott the $10,000 in cash so he wouldn't have to wait for a check to clear. I still have questions about her story. There's not a lot of clarification here. I'm not quite sure how Scott having this cash in his hand is going to help put the truck in John's name or release Scott from the payments or anything like that. And then I wonder, Like, why is there no time to wait for a check to clear? And within her testimony, you learned that they shared more than one bank account. Scott and Jackie shared bank accounts. So why not just deposit that money into the bank? I mean, I don't know. And it wasn't really, there was no clarity there. So I don't know about Jackie's story. But then we also have to realize that John had already been driving Scott's truck for weeks by then. Um, so anyway, for whatever reason, Jackie decided Scott should have this money and that he needed it in cash. And so Jackie met Scott at the San Diego Museum of Art on the 17th so she could give him the cash. This was less than 24 hours before Scott's arrest. You might recall his ticket stub for the grandeur of Viceregal Mexico that was mentioned during our last episode. So, as it turns out, Jackie went with him. She and Scott viewed the exhibit together, and at some point, she handed over the envelope full of cash that Bueller found in the car the next day. It contained $100 bills. Detective Bueller proceeded with a few photos of the interior and the exterior of the Mercedes before it was moved, documenting the appearance and placement of its contents. Most notable were the cell phones visible in the center console and his brother John's ID in the compartment under the stereo. Bueller also noticed an 8x10 photo of Scott and Laci on the floor behind the driver's seat. The picture was on top of some other things piled there, so Bueller removed the items and including the picture and laid them out on the street to be photographed. Under the 8x10 was a pair of Scott's dress shoes, two unwrapped single cigars, two baggies of homemade cookies, and three copies of a children's book called Spot's Windy Day. The books were Easter gifts for Scott's nieces and nephews. The Mercedes was moved to the DOJ office where Bueller began marking state's evidence. One of the items he recovered was a push dagger with a 3.5 inch or 9 centimeter blade. It's called a push dagger because the grip is shaped like the handle on like a pull start lawnmower with a blade attached to the front. So the attack has the force of a push or a punch behind it. These knives or daggers are commonly carried by military and law enforcement because they're lightweight, easily concealed, and designed for violence. And it's understandable why Bueller was taken aback when he found it. Um, while Scott did have other knives and saws, they were in a backpack, and most were designed for utility. This dagger was particularly menacing and easily accessible under the passenger seat. So, but very quickly, detectives realized that the dagger didn't belong to Scott. It belonged to Michael Griffin, who'd overlooked it when he sold Scott the car. But Michael claiming ownership of the dagger did nothing to help Scott's case. Unfortunately for his defense, the remaining evidence in the Mercedes wasn't so easily explained. The majority of Scott's belongings were packed into two brown duffel bags and a backpack. Bueller initially took photos of both bags before they were empty, so we'll view those first. But before we see what Scott's jury saw, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, June's Journey. It's the peak of the roaring 1920s when quick-witted June Parker arrives in New York City. June's traveled home from London upon the deaths of her sister Claire and her brother-in-law Harry. Police pin the rap on Harry and call the case closed, but her keen eye and inquisitive nature immediately tell June their deaths are suspicious, and she couldn't have been more right. June's journey to solve the mystery of their murders brings her back home to her decadent family estate on Orchid Island. It's here that you'll renovate the mansion and customize the grounds while June digs up family secrets. The suspense grows with each chapter as you find hidden objects and reveal clues for June to follow. Complete tasks and collections to earn special items as you progress through the story and put your own finishing touches on the estate. There's always something new to discover on Orchid Island. Scan the QR code or click the link in the description to download June's Journey now and join the adventure. It's free to download, free to play, and available for iOS, Android, and PC. Whether you join a club to compete with other players or enter in-game events solo for prizes, June's Journey offers a perfect blend of intrigue, challenge, and relaxation. I adore the charming vintage aesthetic of the game, and the artwork in each scene is just outstanding. I already have my eye on some decorations to spruce up my mansion, and I can't wait to expand and explore. So thanks so much to June's Journey for supporting the channel and sponsoring today's video. Now let's get back to Scott's luggage. In the first photo, you can see either Bueller or Grogan pointing out more money found in one of the pockets. Between the cash in Scott's bags and the envelope from Jackie, Bueller collected a total of $14,932.25 from the car. That's the equivalent of $25,500 today. Prosecutors presented that money as proof of his preparation to flee the country, and it didn't look good. But Scott might be fortunate that jurors didn't get to see everything found in that car. An article from the Daily Mail claimed that he had a gun with him that day, and while that was plainly false, whatever Scott's plans were, he had more than cookies and children's books packed up for the ride. This bottle of red wine was shown peeking out of one of the bags, but not photographed otherwise or mentioned in court. And the jury never heard about the sleeping pills or the baggie of Viagra Scott had with him either. His defense either blocked that evidence from coming in or prosecutors didn't pursue it. Not that any of those items are illegal or even abnormal, and he probably had prescriptions. His medical stuff was probably fairly easy to keep out of the trial for his defense. And aside from the Viagra making him look like a horn dog or a horny bastard, as some might say, the wine and the sleeping pills aren't relevant anyway. The next photo shown to the jury included Scott's brother's ID, and his father Lee took the stand to try to explain why he had it. Having a fake ID never looks good when you're suspected of fleeing to Mexico, and the evidence was beginning to mount. They already had Jackie passing him a massive amount of cash at a Mexican art exhibit the day before his arrest. Now Scott has his brother's ID, and as we'll see in an upcoming photo, he had some pesos to top it all off. Not very many pesos, like not enough to really buy anything. I think it was only about $3.50 US, but having Mexican currency just wasn't really the best look for his case. The defense brought up his business trip to Guadalajara in early February. Apparently, he'd been carrying those pesos around since then. To be fair, he did seem to be at least partially living out of whatever vehicle he had access to, so maybe he did have the pesos tucked in his wallet or something. It's never specified where they were found. But Scott's attorneys used his trip to Mexico in early February to vouch for his integrity in April, pointing out that Scott made no attempt to flee then and came home knowing he was the focus of law enforcement. While that's fair enough, there were some major differences between early February and mid April. First of all, detectives were made fully aware of that trip. Thanks to his employer Trade Corp, Scott knew that Brocchini knew exactly where he was going and when. It would have been stupid to try to run. But back in February, Scott probably didn't feel the need to. Laci was still a missing person when he took that trip. She hadn't yet been declared a homicide victim, and her remains hadn't washed ashore. So, not quite the same scenario. In fact, it seems Scott didn't start feeling the pressure until Laci was declared deceased. That was on the 5th of March, a full month after he happily returned from Guadalajara, and 11 days later, he made a $377 purchase from a sporting and camping supplies store known as REI. So, just to clarify, Detective Grogan officially declared Laci a homicide victim during a press conference on 5th of March, and Scott's receipt from the Recreational Equipment Incorporated was dated the 16th. So keep those dates in mind as we view the evidence photos, the first of which shows us several interesting things, including his brother's ID and his sister's debit card. Now, if you're not familiar with Scott's sister Ann Bird or his girlfriend Amber Frey, things will make a lot more sense if you catch up with the playlist in the description. Same goes for the Peterson and Rocha families, just so you know who's who moving forward. A lot's gone on with relationships and evidence over the past 23 episodes, so we can't and shan't touch on everything. So let's get back to John Peterson's driver's license. John is one of 4 of Scott's older half brothers. There's Don, Mark, Joe, and John, who's the only brother who physically resembles Scott in any way. So John is also the only brother whose driver's license was coincidentally found in his car. Also coincidentally, though, just on the same note, as we mentioned Scott's oldest half brother, Don. He looks a heck of a lot like Drew Peterson. Like those two could be brothers. Someone pointed this out in the comments like months ago, maybe even a year ago. So Drew Peterson is no relation to Scott or Don, but he's serving a life sentence in Indiana for a very similar crime. Drew's beautiful wife's name was Kathleen Savio, and he does look eerily similar to Scott's brother Don. Of course, this is just one of so many other strange connections between dates and names and other profile cases that are connected to this case, like Elizabeth Smart and Kristen Smart. There are so many, like I could do a whole separate video on that and all the Petersons in this case too. So I mean, we could do something with the comments as well, discussing some of the stories and theories and other curious like things just like this that you guys share. There's a ton of good info from you guys there, so please keep posting. And thanks for sharing as always. And so let's move on. So this picture is one of the first evidence photos Bueller showed the jury from the car, or Dave Harris, prosecutor Dave Harris showed the jury from the car. We see Scott's ID as well as John's, which was found in the compartment under the stereo, remember? And we'll come back to the debit and credit cards shown. So we can, in this photo, we can also see Scott's partially eaten snacks, his keys, his empty wallet, his hat, a trade court business card, and what looks like a couple of ATM receipts and a couple of store receipts. And then there's a letter or a note pictured top left, but I couldn't read it or decipher it, and there was never a description given. So just to the right of that, I noticed this scrap of paper that looks like it could be a phone number. So none of these items were elaborated on during the trial, but I couldn't help when I saw the scrap of paper with what looks like numbers on it. I couldn't help but think of Natalie, the house sitter, from Anne's story. I think that is episode 22 in the playlist. If you don't recall Natalie, you can go back and listen to that because that's a good story. But I mean, if this is a phone number, it wasn't mentioned in court, and I kind of feel like if the prosecution had a girl's phone number and Scott's belongings, like I feel like that would have made it in. I feel like it would have been the judge probably would have called that relevant, and it would have made it into trial, but it didn't. So I don't know. You guys take a look. Let me know what you think. It was lucky enough for Scott that it didn't make it in because he had enough to try to explain as it was. And just like Jackie, Scott's mother, Scott's father Lee jumped in to do what he could to help with that. So he told the jury it was his fault that John's ID was found in the car. So similar to Jackie saying that it had been her idea to put the Mercedes in her name, Lee said he told Scott to get his hands on his brother's driver's license. Not to escape the country and go on the run, of course not that, but to get a discount at the golf course. But there's a bit more coincidence to top off his story. So according to Lee, he and Scott had like long-standing plans to play golf at the Torrey Pines golf course the day he was arrested. Lee said he booked a tee time for 4 players at Torrey Pines a week or two before Scott was pulled over by the DOJ in front of the very same golf course and arrested. So Lee said his other 2 sons, Mark and Joe, were on the reservation for the 18th as well, and that Scott was meant to be their 4th. Lee planned to pay the greens fee for Scott, but wanted the discount that John would get for being a resident of San Diego County. So Torrey Pines is a public golf course. So Lee told Scott to get John's ID to pass off at the golf course. The discount valued today, Lee would have saved between 35 and 75 bucks. And the prosecution, like their immediate, Dave Harris, his immediate question to Lee was, was the trouble and the lie really worth it, considering that Scott was rolling around with nearly $15,000 on him in cash. So with that, Lee kind of got snippy. He got short with Dave Harris and essentially said, Scott wasn't the one paying, I was paying, and I'm cheap. So he told the jury he was cheap like twice just to kind of drive the point home. So at the end of the day, I have no idea why Scott had John's ID or when he got it, but I do know that Scott visited John's place in Ocean Beach on the 16th for certain. A better question might be, how did Lee know Scott would be in town for golf a week or two before his arrest? From what I understand, Scott took a very unplanned trip to San Diego immediately after Laci was found, and he'd only been in the city for a little more than 3 days before his arrest. So why would Lee set a reservation for Scott to play golf on the 18th, a week or two before he showed up? How did he know Scott was coming? How did he know he'd be there on the 18th? I can't answer that, but I can say for certain that Lee and his sons, Mark and Joe, made it to their 8 a.m. tea time at Torrey Pines, and they played 18 holes with a walk on or a stranger instead of Scott as their fourth. So we know Scott was in the middle of his chase with the DOJ while Lee and his brothers were teeing off at Torrey Pines. But what are you guys' thoughts on this golf outing? It's the timing is just a few days after Laci and Connor's remains were found. So, you do have to remember that they weren't officially identified at this point, but I feel like most people were pretty sure it was them, and I know that like Jackie and Lee, they were probably praying that they'd found some other woman and a random baby or something, but it seems kind of out of touch, maybe detached to go golfing when there's even like a remote chance that it's your daughter-in-law and your grandchild. So what's also odd is what we know is also, regardless of when Lee made this reservation to play, Scott was dressed for golf when he was arrested, but there were no clubs found in the car. So, you can make of that what you will. Whatever his reason for having Joe's driver's license is really just a drop in the bucket anyway, compared to some of the other items that were found in that Mercedes. So let's move on. Let's take a look at the bank cards from Scott's wallet. So this is a close-up view of those cards. You'll notice Ann Bird's Washington Mutual card here on the upper right. Anne now claims that she was afraid of Scott at this point during the timeline, but this is clearly her debit card, and she never did accuse him of stealing it. I think if he'd stolen it, she would have mentioned it, but she doesn't. The next photo shows Jackie's Chevron card, which is no real surprise because Jackie supported Scott and openly gave him resources, much like his father and other siblings. So that brings us to the single key Scott had with him. Scott had two key rings full of keys, and then this one key tucked aside somewhere. Again, I don't know where it was found. Bueller never confirmed what it was for either, but we know Scott hid out at Anne's adoptive parents' house before he turned up at Susan's, and before he was at Anne's parents' house, he was at their cabin in Lake Arrowhead. So this could be a key to either or none of those places. But so far, as Anne Bird goes, she didn't seem very fearful during this time. So moving on, there's a business card and Bueller's photo here for a woman named Jennifer Latham. She could be a relative. She does share Jackie's maiden name, but I couldn't confirm enough relatives through like a white pages search to determine who this was. So it's a common last name, just like Peterson. And I don't have ancestry, so I have no idea who Jennifer is. If someone knows, please share in the comments. Next to Jennifer's card is a coupon for a free treat at Baskin Robbins. There's a generic retail receipt, and these things are just keeping with the common theme of no descriptions from Harris or Bueller for us or the jury. So the last thing in this picture is the ticket stub from Scott's trip to the museum with Jackie. So they each paid $6 to view the grandeur of Vice Regal Mexico together. And I'm picturing her like passing him an envelope at the museum, like secret agent like. And it reminds me so much of like a movie scene, a scene from a film, like a spy movie, but then it's really silly because instead of a Bond girl it's his mom instead of like some beautiful, seductive woman or something. I'm so sorry. I do try to stay objective, and I know we're on a serious topic, but some of this stuff is just a bit much. I just can't help it. It's like you can't make this stuff up. Okay, so moving on. The next few photos from Bueller show different angles of the backpack he emptied from the car. So, for those of you only listening to the audio, this backpack is quite a bit larger than a standard size backpack. It's like maybe a hiking type of pack. And it was full to the top when Bueller removed it from the back seat. The exterior of the pack had a long coil of rope attached to one side and a pair of like rugged type sandals hooked onto the other with a carabiner. And there were some extra carabiner like style hooks just attached to the bag. I wondered if maybe you guys could tell from the photos whether they're climbing grade or if this is climbing rope. I just want to know maybe what your opinions are because I know nothing about climbing, but I've not also heard of Scott knowing much about climbing, so maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he climbs and rappels all the time, but I've not heard of that. So I just wondered, like, is this the real deal equipment that he had with him or not? So post in the comments if you know, please. The first group of items Bueller photographed from the backpack, including the folded knives and the folding saw I mentioned earlier when we spoke about the dagger from Michael Griffin. So Scott also had a pair of small folding scissors and a package of single edge razor blades. So he has like two folding pocket knives, I think, and a folding saw. And in this photo, there are also three work gloves. I don't know what happened to Scott's other work glove. There are two lefts and a right, and all three of them are filthy dirty. The cases for the knives are shown in the photo as well. And then there's this small aerosol spray can. I don't know what it is. I tried to look it up by the label and the font and stuff on the writing, but I couldn't find anything. So if you guys can track that down, I'm kind of, I don't know. I mean, not super interested in knowing what this is, but I mean, I didn't know if it was compressed air or something like that. So I don't know what that is. And then there is a brown thing here that looks kind of like a fat, rotten banana, but I think I'm guessing it's not that. I'm thinking it's cloth. If I had to guess, I would say it's a dirty shop rag, but all opinions are welcome on that, and with no description and no idea why it's here, what it is, why it's being shown to the jury, no explanation of what the heck it even is. So I don't know, your guess is as good as mine. um so just for a little context, these photos are being presented in court by prosecutor Dave Harris as Detective Bueller sits on the stand. And during this process, Harris tells the jury like at least twice, like two or three times, he says the photos speak for themselves, and he'll get a new slide up and he'll just say, well, the photos speak for themselves. And Bueller doesn't say much at all. There are cherry picked items through here, and when they elaborate, I'll elaborate so that you know what I know. But this next photo is a good example of that type of thing. So here, um, Harris is sure to point out the duct tape in the photo, and of course, there's another rather large knife, and he definitely, had Bueller acknowledge that but really, it's just it's acknowledgement that it exists from Bueller. He's not telling the jury where this, I mean, I guess all of these things were in the backpack, but for a lot of these other things, were they found in the car? Were they, in this duffel bag? Were they, I don't know. So they also pointed out the water purifier in this photo. So the jury definitely knew that he had a water purifier, a mess kit, and cooking utensils. So the next slide that the jury was shown showed this simple hammock. This net looking thing is a hammock. There's a small hatchet, a pair of binoculars, and a snorkeling mask that's still in the packaging with the tag on. The next photo is just a photo of Scott's coat and a golf glove. So not all of these are as relevant as other things. So we'll spend less time, like, let's move on from the coat. But I did want to show at least a quick view of everything the jury saw that came out of the car so that you guys could see the same thing that they saw. So this next photo shows Scott's multi-tool. All the little tools and gadgets are spread open next to the case. And there's a fishing rod here with an open face reel. There was no line on the reel, and the price tag is still on the pole. Next in line for the jury was a flathead shovel, and it's not like a small camp shovel, folding shovel or something. It's like a real garden shovel, like waist high, metal and wood. So I wondered with this if it might be the one Anne mentioned from the Lake Arrowhead cabin, like early on in the series. But Bueller said nothing but literally the word shovel when the slide came up for the jury, and Harris moved on. So Harris moved on to Scott's assortment of boots and dress shoes and sandals. So there were at least 9 pair documented in total throughout the car, and there are 7 just in this picture. These 7 were found in the trunk. The next few photos show Scott's clothes. This is just a pair of khakis and some black joggers or sweatpants or something. Um, we have a long sleeve white button up and a short sleeve polo. They're both white. Next are two dark long sleeve polo sweaters. At least one of them has the Trade Corp logo. Again, Trade Corp is where Scott worked. He was a fertilizer salesman. So the next picture shows us two pair of rather short pleated khaki shorts and a red patterned shirt. The next is more clothing: drawstring shorts, a Padres shirt, and another pair of jeans. The next is more shirts: long sleeve Adidas, a short sleeve Nike, a plain black t shirt. The jury did see all of these photos just like we are. They went through them quickly. Our next slide shows a folded dark polo shirt and a gray scarf. There's a dress sweater here and another pair of jeans. And we can see Scott's belt in this photo, along with another pair of his dress shoes. These two things here, the red and the silver that look like travel cups, I believe these held Scott's ties. They were like travel, roll your tie into a thing. And next to those is a tin of Altoids. So these coins came out of the pocket of the shorts he was wearing when he was arrested. And so above the coins and above the jeans are several blue and yellow ribbon pins. Now, these are the pins that were worn by masses of people during the search for Laci and Connor, showing support and hope for their safe return, including Scott and his parents and siblings. It's sad to see them scattered there, laying there with Scott's pocket change and Altoids and stuff. And the little ribbons, those must have been a little difficult to look at after Laci and Connor were finally found. They didn't mean what they'd meant just a few days before Bueller took this photo. It's just sad to see them laying there like that, and they just hurt my heart when I went through these pictures. The next photo shows us Scott's socks and underwear. So, I mean, I suppose that I'd want my socks and panties on display, but those there on the left are like straight yellow. So, I mean, I don't know what's going on with Scott. Like, I don't know. So, quickly moving away from the Scott socks and grundles, we can see his pesos and a business card for a massage therapist, but I can't make out the name. Again, if you guys can, I could look into that. There's another set of keys here, and that is shown next to a book of stamps and another quarter. I don't know why this quarter is separate. It's kind of weird. I thought all the change came out of Scott's pocket of his shorts, and I think it was 66 cents in total. So I'm not sure why this quarter is over here with these other things. Um, we can see several pens in this picture, including one that's fancy enough to have like a case. And then above that is a $150 check from his sister in law, Janie Peterson. For many of you, Janie needs no introduction, but she's been married to Scott's older half brother, Joe, since 1986. All six of Scott's older half siblings either share a different mother or father, but his sister in law, Janie, has been the most involved in his case, by far. And when I say involved, I mean super involved. So much so that Janie spent years earning her law degree to help Scott with his defense. There's plenty more to come from Janie as we get into his appeals and his habeas corpus proceedings, but it seems the women in Scott's family were a significant source of his financial support during the investigation. Janie wrote Scott this $150 check on the 12th of April. We've already seen the bank cards from both Anne and Jackie. While there was no evidence of monetary assistance from his other sister, Susan Caudillo, that was found in the car, the two bags of homemade cookies were most likely baked by Susan. You'll recall it was Susan's garage that Scott pulled the Mercedes out of early that morning. But like we said, he was carrying around more than cookies before his arrest. So the next slide shown to the jury depicts 4 cell phones, 4 found in the car. I've been trying to say the Mercedes rather than Scott's Mercedes because I'm fairly sure that Jackie paid for the car. I don't think that Scott bought this car. I think that it's a really roundabout way, but Jackie does explain. I'm pretty sure she paid for the Mercedes. Anyway, there are 4 cell phones found. At least 2 of them were found in the center console. The other 2 were found elsewhere, I believe, but I can't read the text on the evidence bag to say where for certain. It very well could say center console. I can't make heads or tails of it. So if you guys can hone in on that, and maybe we can. It doesn't really matter where they were found. The guy's got 4 cell phones. I don't know. So yeah. So if you guys are able to decipher those things, that would be awesome. The note and the phone number and names on the business cards. So moving on to the next slide. This is the same brown duffel bag we saw earlier. Now, this is before it was emptied, and these are the contents. So, I think these are the same music CDs we have already seen, but the California Road Atlas is new, and so is the Thomas Guide to Central Valley Cities. Make note of the Nora Jones CD while we're here because it comes up later. We can see a pair of sunglasses, a baseball cap, and a paper with some handwriting. Again, I have no idea what it says. Bueller didn't mention it on the stand. The most notable item here is a book. The book is in the upper right-hand corner of this photo. This is a copy of Rick Warren's book titled The Purpose-Driven Life. Amber Frey mailed Scott this book in mid-February. So the Wikipedia description reads as follows. The Purpose Driven Life offers readers a 40-day personal spiritual journey and presents what Warren says are God's 5 purposes for human life on earth. Now, that seems like a tall order to fill in 40 days, but the book sold millions of copies, and Amber, as we know, is an optimist. So she did get permission from Detective Bueller to send Scott this book. Bueller was sort of her handler throughout the entirety of the investigation. But Amber also bought a copy of Warren's book for herself, intending to work through it with Scott so that they might find God's purpose together. I don't know if Scott ever opened the book. We'll circle back to that question, but he was obviously still carrying it around when he was arrested, along with the note Amber sent with it. So, as we're reading that note, which is dated the 16th of February, we should bear in mind that the last call Amber made to Scott was on the 19th. So, just 3 days after she wrote this note. That call was very brief, and it was made at Detective Bueller's request. Bueller essentially told Amber it was no longer necessary to record their calls, that their conversation had become fruitless for weeks, and that he advised her to break ties with Scott. In fact, Bueller wanted to listen in on the call when Amber broke the news, that when she broke it off. Bueller wasn't sure how Scott would react, and he wanted to hear it firsthand. Amber knew Bueller's request was for her own safety, and she still made that last call on the 19th without Bueller present. But she did get his approval to mail Scott The Purpose Driven Life 3 days before that. However, I don't imagine Bueller was aware of this note or Amber's plans to work through the book, and you'll see what I mean by work through the book with Scott. So I can't say for certain that Amber and Scott spoke after the 19th of February, like literally spoke on the phone, but she was emailing him throughout March for sure. And then so now we have this note in the book on the 16th. Um, and then the call to say they shouldn't talk until there's a resolution 3 days later is made on the 19th. So she and Scott emailed several times during the following weeks after that. So just so we know those things as we're reading this note. So Amber writes, Scott, thank you for the gifts. Could you write me and tell me what it was about one of the gifts that you didn't want to tell me over the phone? Please. What songs touch your heart most from the Nora Jones CD? For the next 40 days, I think it would be best to read a chapter every day. Begin on March 1st, 03, to read The Purpose Driven Life together. After each chapter, write in the book like it suggests to do. After 40 days, let's mail each other our books. After we receive each other's book and review, I will call you. Please write me. This has been so hard. I can only hope that this all comes to an end soon. I wish I could go back in time. I'm praying for you and your family. Amber. So when she says to read The Purpose Driven Life together, together is underlined for those of you who have audio only. And then when she says, I will call you, you is underlined. So just so you know where the emphasis was, what Amber intended, where she wanted the emphasis to be in her note. So let's quickly explain the references Amber makes within the note. She starts off thanking Scott for her gifts. Those gifts would be the gifts that Scott stashed in the bush for her outside the children's hospital. That was on February 10th, which was both Connor's due date and Amber's birthday. I have details on this somewhere in the series, but I'm not sure which episode. I'm sorry. Um, it's this kind of stuff that just puts Scott in this case like over the top, though. So what he did was he hid a Trader Joe's bag that was full of presents for his girlfriend in a shrubbery the morning of his missing son's due date. And then that afternoon, he guided her to the spot over the phone. So, like scavenger hunt style, so that Amber could find it. This is how he's spending his day. This is Connor's due date. And this wasn't even the first spot that he drove this Trader Joe bag to. He had to move it that morning because Amber left too late to stop at the first place where he stashed it. So anyway, it seems like I mean, it's effort and hours and time. I don't know about hours, but it's like wrong focus, dude. So anyway, the gifts Amber mentioned in her note from the car are the gifts from the bush. They include an amber necklace that was in the silver gift box, wildflower seeds, and a Nora Jones CD. And we just saw Scott's own copy of his Nora Jones CD, and Amber's asking which Nora Jones song touched his heart that from the CD he gave her. So anyway, like asking about the gift and the music may have been Amber fishing for a clue about Laci. Maybe she was hoping he'd say something or mention a song title or lyric, something she could share with Bueller to help the investigation. The Nora Jones album was titled Come Away With Me, so whether she was digging or just asking, Amber was clearly expecting to hear back from Scott. In fact, she's almost pleading for him to respond. She closes the note telling him how hard this has all been and that she hopes it'll all be over soon, and then she says she wishes she could go back in time. I can't help but wonder what drove her to say that. What would Amber Frey change if she could go back in time? So moving on, she let Scott know that she was praying for him and his family, and then mailed the card and the book to Modesto. So, just now that you know what I know about the book and the note, let's talk about the map. So, Scott also had a map to Amber's workplace when he was arrested. He printed the map on the 16th of April, probably from Tom and Jerry's computer, which is Ann Bird's adopted parents. So, the map to American Body Works, where Amber worked as a massage therapist, was printed the day after Scott arrived in San Diego, which was 2 days before his arrest. A lot of people think that he printed that map so that he could hunt Amber down and pay her back for working with the police, but his defense claimed otherwise. Scott had Amber's home address if he wanted to harm her, but you also kind of have to decide if he was trying to run to Mexico or go after Amber because Fresno is like 5 hours north. If he'd been really compelled to get Amber, Scott could have stopped in Fresno on his way down south to San Diego and probably done away with her in private at her house, rather than drive hundreds of miles back north to a public place to do something to her. But the, I won't claim to know a bit about what's in Scott Peterson's mind, and his attorney's explanation for the map wasn't great either. So Scott's defense claimed that he printed Amber's work address so that he could mail the purpose driven life back when he was done with it. Um, Amber asked him to read a chapter a day, remember, for 40 days, and the timeline does work out. So if Scott started on March 1st, like Amber told him to, he would have been done on April 9th. And then the map was printed a week later. But do you guys think that he read this book and like annotated each chapter and he was like prepping to mail it back to Amber? It never came up in court, so I don't know. I don't know if he actually did the work in the book to find God or find his purpose, God's purpose for him. But how much of the purpose driven life do you guys think Scott got through? And then what do you think about Amber and the map? Do we think he had plans to drive up to Fresno? Was Amber next? I do wonder how the jury felt about Scott having that map. And I'm kind of even more curious about their reaction to the search flyers for Laci that the prosecution showed next. So the missing flyers for Laci were on one of the last slides that Harris showed that came from the evidence that came from the car. But why did Scott have them? Was he still hanging them up? Or was he just keeping a few around so that it looked like he was still searching for Laci? He did have missing posters in his vehicle during a search warrant in February, but this was April, and I don't know for sure. You guys might know better than me, but I feel like by this point, even Laci's family had stopped hanging flyers. I can't be sure about that, but it just seems odd. And then when did Scott pack these in the car? He just bought the car on the 12th, and Laci was found on the 14th. They must have already been in the car when he left for San Diego, but what good would it do to hang them in San Diego? And then why are there only 15 of them? So these are things that we may never know. We do know that the $500,000 reward on these flyers was no longer up for grabs, and it hadn't been for weeks. And we know that the longer that $500,000 went unclaimed, the more certain detectives became of Scott's guilt. Grogan and his men figured if some other local sleazeball had committed this crime, that at least one of his sleazeball buddies would have heard about it. And there's no honor among thieves, and not many are willing to keep a $500,000 secret. So Grogan supposed if there'd been a suspect other than Scott, someone would have snitched and claimed the money early on. But that's kind of a shaky theory, and it crumbles if the snitch can't cash in. The reward was for Laci's safe return. So if the sleazeball already knows that Laci's dead, or the buddy knows that she's dead, he's not getting paid, and then he's not going to call. So when Grogan classified Laci as a homicide on March 5th, that reward dropped from 500,000 for her safe return to 50,000 for the recovery of her remains. Half of that $50,000 was given to Michael and Belanger Luby, whose dog led to Connor, and the remaining 25,000 was split between Alina Gonzalez, her sister, and their father, whose dogs led to Laci. So the flyer reads missing $500,000 reward. Laci Peterson, age 27, height 5'1", hair brown, eyes brown, 8 months pregnant. Last seen near Dry Creek walking her golden retriever. The last several slides shown to the jury displayed all of the cash found in the car, and as prosecutor Dave Harris would say, the pictures of Scott's $14,932.25 speak for themselves. At some point while searching the Mercedes in San Diego, Detective Grogan caught wind of a press conference through a colleague back in Modesto. It was the announcement for a match for the DNA on Laci and Connor. But the detectives kept the news to themselves during the first leg of their trip home. Scott quietly stared out the window for most of the drive back to Stanislaus County. They had Craig Grogan's car, but John Bueller drove, and Brocchini rode up front, while Scott and Grogan spent 6 hours in the back seat together. He wore a white golf polo and shorts, dark sunglasses, and handcuffs, but no wedding ring. This was no surprise to Grogan. He knew Bueller had found it in his duffel bag, but it definitely raised some eyebrows with the jury. Scott's wedding ring was found packed in his duffel bag, and Bueller photographed it on top of a CD case to make it more visible. The four of them were just outside of Bakersfield when Grogan got a call on his cell phone. It was the coroner's office in Richmond. They needed to notify Scott of the deaths of Laci and Connor because he was their next of kin. Due to the circumstances, the coroner asked Grogan to deliver the message, and a tear rolled down Scott's cheek when he did. What, if anything, Scott said in response to that message wasn't allowed in at trial. Neither was the trip to In-Out Burger in Bakersfield. Detective Bueller described Scott ordering a double-double and fries as if he were unfazed less than an hour later. It was just after midnight when Grogan's car pulled into the lot at the Stanislaus County Jail, but the late hour didn't stop a few hundred furious locals from swarming the sidewalks. They knew Scott was coming, and so did the media. Several cameras captured the mob carrying signs scrawled with baby killer and murderer in dark, bold letters. They screamed at the rolled-up windows, and they grew incensed as Grogan pulled Scott from the car in handcuffs. And Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, nearly joined them. Sharon watched the scene live from her living room instead, but she was fond of those signs. While she hoped Scott would read every disparaging word and scornful insult, her motivation to join the crowd wasn't to scream at her son-in-law. Sharon wanted to see his face. She wanted to search his eyes, curious if they held any shred of remorse, now that the walls were closing in. Scott seemed oblivious to the screaming crowd as Grogan paused with him next to the car. Sharon studied his face intently for what seemed like a long while. Scott was still, calm even, and not a fissure of shame or regret touched his brow. Seconds later, Grogan led Scott by the arm through a nondescript door on the side of the building, but Scott was only out of view for a moment. The cameras flocked to the windows, and Sharon watched him photographed and fingerprinted before being moved to another room. Scott was booked into the Stanislaus County Jail at 12:09 a.m. on the 19th of April. Detective Grogan submitted the following narrative with his probable cause declaration. On Friday, 4/18/03 at 11:10 hours, DOJ Special Agent Supervisor Ernie Lyman, Special Agent Peter Scheer, and Officer Claude Gerbon completed a felony traffic stop and arrest at my request. Scott Lee Peterson was arrested for an outstanding probable cause warrant in San Diego County, California. Peterson waived booking in that jurisdiction and was transported to Stanislaus County Jail for booking. We can also see in this declaration that the car was released, the Mercedes was released to Joe Peterson on the day of Scott's arrest. Sharon would see Scott face to face at his arraignment 3 days later, still searching his eyes for signs of remorse. She sensed fear in Scott that day for the first and only time, but no remorse. She'd never seen a hint of remorse. How could Sharon not think back to the 8th of February, to the last conversation she would ever have with her son-in-law? "I have no remorse," he said. "I have no remorse because I've done nothing wrong." His words must stick in her mind like thorns to this day. As most of us already know, Scott Peterson was not only arrested, but tried, convicted, and sentenced to death in 2005. But Sharon's nightmare didn't end in San Quentin 2 decades ago. With his death sentence overturned in 2020, Scott remains alive and well in Ione, California, serving life without parole in Mule Creek State Prison. He's acquired new counsel through the Los Angeles Innocence Project and gained massive public support for his bid for a new trial. As of today, we're awaiting DNA test results that will heavily impact the court's decision on whether or not to grant Scott a new day in court. The piece of duct tape found attached to Laci at autopsy is currently being tested by a Redlands-based lab called Pure Gold Forensics, and the results are long overdue. I hope to and plan to go live when those results do come back, and I hope you'll join me so that we can discuss them. More details on the tape and the autopsy can be found in episode 21 of the playlist. Hit the little bell so you'll be notified when we go live. Subscribe and stay tuned for the next episode. We'll pick up with Scott's arraignment and catch up the timeline to jury selection and the trial. I don't plan to go too deep into the state's case because a good portion of this series kind of has been the state's case. There is a bit more behavior from Scott that we haven't discussed yet, including another girlfriend. But I'm hoping to summarize the high points from the prosecution and turn most of the focus onto Scott's defense. So our next episode will likely be a long one. We have drama to explore before, during, and after the trial, both in and out of the courtroom. And we'll follow Sharon and the Rocha family as they memorialize Laci and Connor and finally lay them to rest. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked the episode, give it a thumbs up before you go. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for notifications. And don't forget to check out June's Journey. The link is down in the description. It really is a super cute, super fun game. As always, until next time, stay safe, be kind, and memento mori.